Hello and welcome to the lecture on forms of business ownership. I think this is really going to be useful information for you down the road as you maybe start a business one day or join a small company to know what the advantages and disadvantages are about different ways that companies or organizations can organize themselves. So all forms of business, small companies, big companies, all fit one of these specific categories. And I'll talk about each one in greater length. So a sole proprietorship is a single individual owner. If you're fixing cars in your garage on the weekend for extra money, you're a sole proprietor. I do financial planning for companies and budget analysis and forecasting, and I charge them for that. I'm acting as a sole proprietor in that situation. It's just an individual engaged in business. A partnership is two or more people that come together in an effort to make a profit. So pooling their resources, pooling their talents to run a business. Corporation is a legal organization that has a legal life separate from that of its owners. There's quite a few corporations in this country for sure. And then there are also some specialized forms that I'll talk about briefly as well that don't fit into one of those top three categories. So sole proprietorships are the most businesses are sole proprietorships. You see 72% of all businesses fit that category, but their sales are very small because again, it's individuals acting as a business. So partnerships a little bit more common, but the sales are a little bit higher as well. Corporations, now you can see that's 80% of all of the sales by organizations in the US are from corporations. So all of the companies that I worked for over my career were all corporations. So a sole proprietorship, that's a business that's established, owned, and operated by a single person. It's easy to establish. You don't really need to do anything from a legal standpoint other than notify the state that you're engaged in business and apply for any kind of licenses that you might need. For example, if you're going to open up a nail shop doing manicures, you need a license to be able to do that. So there might be some licensing issues, but from a legal standpoint, it's simple and fairly easy. So if you're in a business that has very low liability exposure, you're not likely to cause harm to other people through your business, then it can work. Like when I mentioned that I do financial planning for some businesses, there's not a lot of liability associated with that, so I'm fairly comfortable with that. So some of the advantages and disadvantages of a sole proprietorship, starting with the advantages, it's simple to form. Again, you don't really need an attorney, anything like that. All of the money that's made goes to the owner. So they take the risk, they reap the reward entirely to themselves. There is direct control of the business by the owner. You don't have to convince other people what you want to do. There is no separate tax, meaning that all of the activity of that sole proprietorship is going to be reflected on the personal income tax return of the owner. So they'll file a Schedule C that'll indicate what money they've collected and what expenses they incurred in generating that revenue. And so they'll pay tax on it on their personal tax return. And then it's easy to dissolve. So when it comes to the point where you want to end the business, that's pretty easy to shut the doors. Some of the disadvantages. That first one is the biggest one. No limitation on personal legal liability. So there is no difference between you and your company. So your personal assets, you might have retirement savings, you might have a home, you might have cars, all of those kinds of things. You may have investments. All of those are subject to a lawsuit if you do damage to somebody. Say you're working on cars in your garage and because you have failed to recognize yourself as a partnership or register as a corporation, by default you're a sole proprietorship. You forget to connect somebody's brake lines and they drive off and get in a car accident. That person can sue you and all of your personal assets are at risk to satisfy the claims of that lawsuit. So it's very risky from that standpoint. It has a limited life, meaning when the owner dies, the business ends. It doesn't live on beyond you. There's a limited ability to raise capital. So if you need money to acquire machinery or computers or something to help you with your business, you basically as an individual have to either put your own money in or borrow money personally to put it in. And then if there are losses, of course, the owner is on the hook for that. So a partnership, as I mentioned earlier, is an association of two or more people who agree to operate a business together for a profit. There is no legal requirement to have a partnership agreement. So if you engage in informal activity with a couple of friends, pooling your resources, working together to make some money, it could be a short-term thing. You in effect have informally created a partnership, and all of the issues that I describe about the partnership will apply to that activity. So it's important to know that it could kind of happen in a sneaky way. I highly recommend, and I actually misspoke earlier, I have been in one partnership. It's really important to have a written partnership agreement. So if you sit down with your potential partners and talk about all of the issues that might come up. For example, how do we go about admitting new partners? How do we split the profits? If we have a shortfall in terms of capital, how do we bring more money into the business? What are the obligations? What do each of the partners require to do for the business? You don't want to have arguments later when somebody's only working 5 hours a week when you thought they were going to put in 40 hours a week. So all of those things that can be hashed out, how you're going to break up at the end of the business, right? Who takes what and how does that get resolved? So having a written agreement like that is really, really important. I can't stress that enough. There are different kinds of partnerships. A general partnership is where all of the partners have some form of liability. A limited partnership would mean some partners would have liability and some would not. So some of the advantages of partnerships, they are relatively simple to form. I would recommend using an attorney to at least look over your partnership agreement. Oftentimes they can say, hey, you forgot about this, or this needs to be worded differently. So that's a good idea, but it's still relatively simple to do. There is more capital available compared to a sole proprietorship because now you have multiple individuals that can bring resources to the endeavor. There is a diversity of skills and expertise. So together you are more than you are individually. The whole is greater than the sum of the parts is another way of saying there could be synergy. So finding complementary partners that each bring something different to the partnership can really create something that's magical. There is no separate tax to a partnership. So the partnership files a tax return at the end of the year that's informational. It just tells the IRS, this is how much money we made, and here are the owners, and here's how we split up the profit. And so each of those owners then would get a K-1, which is similar to a W-2, and it would tell them how much of the income of the partnership they need to include on their personal tax return. And the partners pay individual income tax on their share. The big disadvantage is there is also no limitation on personal liability for partners. The problem is it's joint and several liability. So say I enter a partnership with two other people. Let's say I have very little net worth and another partner has very little net worth, but the third partner is very wealthy. If we get involved in a lawsuit of some kind and we lose and there's a judgment against our partnership, that judgment could be satisfied by just the wealthy partner. They could have to pay the entire thing, and then it's up for them to come after the other two partners to get their share. So each partner is individually, personally liable for all of the liabilities of the partnership. That's the single biggest reason to be wary about partnerships. There's potential for conflict because, again, people can have different views about what the direction should be, so that can be dicey. Mutual agency means that each of the partners in a general partnership can obligate the partnership. So I could be in that partnership with those other two people I mentioned earlier, and one of the other partners could say, I just signed a lease on a building for 5 years. The partnership is now obligated for that. So whether we talked about it in advance or not. And they are, of course, more difficult to dissolve. So you have to figure out, how are we going to break up? Is it, if I leave, are the other two going to continue? How do we split up the assets? All of those kinds of things are potential complications. So as I mentioned, most businesses in terms of sales volume are corporations. It's a separate legal entity and it is subject to the laws of the state in which it's incorporated. So if you start a corporation, it's relatively a little bit more complicated to do, but still relatively easy and inexpensive. You would register under any state you choose to. It doesn't have to be the state in which you're located. A lot of people organize their corporation in the state of Delaware because it has very favorable laws regarding ownership of corporations and protections for corporations. There's actually more corporations in Delaware than there are citizens in Delaware. So you can pick any state you want. A corporation can own property, enter into contracts on its own, it can sue other people and be sued by people. And of course, it has a life that exists beyond that of its owner. I mean, Ford Motor Company was started by Henry Ford. Well, Ford Motor Company is still going on, and Henry Ford has long since died, of course. So it's owned by stockholders that generally have one vote per share. So the number of shares you own in a corporation determines the extent of the influence you have on the direction of that corporation. Meaning if you have less than 50%, you're not in control of that corporation. So the hierarchy in a corporation starts with stockholders. So stockholders could own common stock or preferred stock, two different types of stock. Generally, it's only common stock that has voting shares, but it's the shareholders or stockholders. Those words are synonymous. They own the company, and so they vote with their shares. They elect the board of directors. So people decide to run to be on the board of directors for a corporation, and they say, this is my vision for the company. This is what I think is important. And shareholders can say, I agree with that. I want that person on the group that steers this company. And so they vote. And that influences the direction of the company through the makeup of the board of directors. That board of directors deals with just the very big issues in the company, like should we acquire a competitor, should we sell a division of our company, should we expand internationally, those kinds of big things. And they also hire and manage the top management. So the CEO, the chief executive officer of the company, the chief financial officer of the company, different companies can have different types of high-ranking people. Those people are hired by the board of directors and would be fired by the board of directors. So if you think the CEO of a big company doesn't have a boss, they do. It's the board of directors. That top management, often called the C-suite because they all start with the word chief, and they hire middle management. So the marketing manager, the product line managers, production managers, those kinds of things. And those people then hire supervisory managers, people that are actually on the shop floor directing activities each day or in a department, that sort of thing. So some of the advantages of corporations, one, they have limited liability. So the liability is limited to the corporation, so it doesn't cross over and get to the personal assets of the owners. So that's the biggest reason. When I owned my company, Big Toys, the playground manufacturing company, I knew that children would fall off and break an arm and sue us, that sort of thing. And I didn't want to have my personal assets at risk of those kinds of lawsuits. And so I started the company as a corporation. For that reason. It makes transferring ownership easier. So ownership in a corporation is signified by shares. So you can sell your shares to somebody else and then they are an owner of the corporation. You can sell all of them or part of them, whatever. It has an unlimited life. It goes on beyond the life of the founder. And it's much easier to attract capital. So if it's a business that is going to be very capital intensive, meaning you have to build a factory or you need to bring online significant technology or those kinds of things, this is generally the path that people take because they can go through all the regulatory hoops that they need to be able to issue shares of stock to the public. And they can raise very large amounts of money where people think, hey, this might be the next big thing. I want to own shares in that company. The biggest disadvantage is double taxation of profits. Let's say our company makes $100,000 in net income, and we're happy about that. The tax rate is currently 21%. So they pay $21,000 to the federal government. The corporation files its own tax return. Now there's $79,000 left. If they share that with the owners by paying dividends, the owners now pay tax on those dividends. So the net income is taxed twice to some extent. It is a little more costly and complex to form. Attorneys are generally involved in forming corporations, and there is more government oversight, so more regulatory activity associated with corporations. There are different types of corporations. So the most common is a C corporation, and it could be publicly traded, meaning you can buy and sell shares of the corporation on a stock exchange, or it could be privately owned. My company was privately traded. It was just my wife and I that owned the shares, so nobody else owned any. You could form an S corporation, which is similar to a C corp, but it's taxed like a partnership. So it avoids double taxation, but there are limits on how many shareholders there could be. My company, Big Toys, was an S corporation, so the net income flowed onto our personal tax return. So because we were the sole owners, we didn't want that double taxation. And you can also be a not-for-profit corporation. That's where earning a profit isn't the goal of the business. The goal is something else: feeding homeless people, educating children, building homes for the needy. Those kinds of things are not what not-for-profit corporations do. And they have some other requirements that they're subjected to. So specialized forms of business organization, one is a cooperative. That's where owners join together to operate all or part of an industry. So there are farm co-ops where they have central grain storage that they all participate in and use. Dairy Gold, if you've seen their dairy products on the shelf in stores, Dairy Gold is a cooperative of a bunch of dairy farmers in Western Washington that get together, pool their resources. None of them are big enough to run ads on TV and those kinds of things and make agreements with Safeway and all of that. So they formed a cooperative where they all participate in that and kind of function as a large business, even though they're not. Ace Hardware is another example of that. Ace Hardware isn't one big company. It's a bunch of privately owned hardware stores that work together to try to compete against big box stores. Joint ventures are two companies that come together for a specific project. Once that project is done, generally that's over. And then franchise, you're all familiar with franchises if you've been to a Subway or many McDonald's or Chick-fil-A or those kinds of places. Those are all independently owned, where somebody has paid money to a large corporation for the right to own a Subway franchise, as an example. And they are allowed to use the name and all of that under kind of strict rules about what they can do and can't do, but it's kind of a turnkey way to get a business. So the last point I want to make is about mergers and acquisitions. That's companies purchasing each other or coming together to form a new company. So a merger is when two companies come together to form a brand new third company that operates as one. A lot of times companies will do that if they need access to a new market. Say I want to market my products in South America and I don't have any business established there at all. The quickest way for me to get into that market might be to acquire a South American company that has offices and employees and people that understand the laws of the countries in South America and have contacts there. If I acquire that company, I immediately get all of that in my business rather than creating it from the ground up, which can be time-consuming and expensive. An acquisition is where one company buys another company and then the acquired company no longer exists. It's folded into the new company. When I sold my business, it was acquired by a much larger company. So now it's not an independent business any longer. It's part of their business. There are vertical, horizontal, and conglomerate mergers. Vertical is when you're either acquiring your sales force, so you're expanding into the distribution of your product, or you're acquiring your suppliers, so you're expanding into the supply chain for your business, so you're going up towards customers or down towards your suppliers. Horizontal is expanding into new markets or new product categories, like the South American example I gave. And conglomerate mergers aren't quite as popular anymore, but they're where you buy a completely unrelated business that might offset the risk in your core business. So conglomerates, General Electric was a conglomerate at one point where they owned a lot of different jet engines and making light bulbs and all kinds of different companies that were all pooled together. So thank you for your attention. I look forward to talking to you in the next lecture.